We often link strategic thinking to conflict, but strategic thinking can also help us develop cooperative solutions to problems. Empirical evidence demonstrates that order can evolve out of chaos through individuals pursuing their own self-interest, and an entire body of theory has evolved that posits collaborative strategies. These are strategies that firms and individuals can follow that will yield fruitful results without the destructive behavior we associate with conflict. Cooperation theory suggests ways that we can cooperate with others for mutual benefit, even with competitors, even with enemies. It was Christmas, 1914, just 4 months into what would become one of the bloodiest conflicts in history, World War I. Trench lines stretched from the Belgian coast south to the Swiss frontier, and the war was in stalemate. Most of the bloodshed was in the future. The nasty trench warfare with its blinding mustard gas attacks, the suicidal over-the-top charges into machine gun fire, all of this was still beyond even the most morose imagination to conceive. On this Christmas occurred something that every general fears and every general works desperately to prevent: mass collaboration with the enemy. We most often link strategic thinking and strategy to conflict, but strategic thinking can also help us develop cooperative solutions to problems. This lecture suggests ways that we can cooperate with others for mutual benefit, even with a fierce competitor. Now, so much of life is competitive, and perhaps this is natural in a world of economic scarcity. Political philosophy tells us to expect conflict, from Thucydides in the 5th century BC, to Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, to Karl Marx in the 19th century. Philosophers of all persuasions have suggested that conflict is endemic to the human condition. According to Thomas Hobbes, the only remedy for these inevitable conflict was strong central government, since he believed that cooperation could not develop without a strong state. Incidentally, this was the underlying belief, deeply ingrained, that animated the Soviet Union and has reappeared even in post-Soviet Russia, that only a guiding central authority can possibly ward off chaos. But history shows us that cooperation can emerge, even in the most conflictual of situations, even during war. World War I presented us with the spectacle of mainly Christian nations fighting each other: Britain, France, and Russia on one side, and Germany and Austria-Hungary on the other. The religion of the combatants was relevant here. Christmas was a holy day and shared holiday for the combatants on both sides. On this first Christmas of the war, in 1914, soldiers on both sides saw no reason not to call their own truce and celebrate Christmas Eve with the enemy. The truce began in true spontaneous fashion. Germans received small Christmas trees from home in the mail. They positioned them on the parapets of their trenches Christmas Eve, and they lit them with candles. In the majority of areas, it was Germans facing English. And up and down the line, both sides began calling to each other, offering Christmas greetings, singing Christmas carols. At dawn, the first tentative movements out of the trenches began, ostensibly to bury the dead left in the no-man's land between the trenches. But the truce quickly spread, and Germans and English met and mingled freely in many places along the line, exchanging gifts and even addresses. In at least one place, a soccer match was held. Despite the best efforts of both high commands to maintain hostilities, the truce continued throughout the day, and in some places, for several days beyond Christmas. It broke down inevitably as new soldiers moved into the line on both sides as replacements. But additional examples of cooperation during the conflict continued. In the summer of 1915, in many places along the line, neither side would shell the other side's supply trains, because neither side wanted to do without rations. Even personal time was respected in one section of the line. Between 8 and 9 a.m., soldiers would conduct their private business in latrine areas marked by flags that were out of bounds for snipers on both sides. So how is this possible, this spontaneous truce, this spontaneous cooperation in the midst of a deadly conflict situation? Research on the question shows that the unique characteristic of trench warfare led to, first, communication, and then cooperation. The same small combat units were faced off against each other for extended periods of time. The soldiers of these opposing small units acted against orders from their own high commands to cooperate with each other in a literal live and let live system. So even in these unlikely situations, cooperation can get a foothold. It can evolve, and it can even remain stable in situations which otherwise appear unpromising. Friendship is not necessary for the development of cooperation. Now today, many scholars believe that there is a way to cooperate when it makes sense strategically, even under conditions of potential conflict. Robert Axelrod led the way in crafting cooperation theory with an important book in 1984 called The Evolution of Cooperation. Axelrod wanted to identify the conditions necessary for cooperation to emerge, and then discover what actions could be taken to create those conditions. He examined not only trench warfare in World War I, but also an only slightly less contentious forum, the United States Senate. Axelrod saw that in spite of the self-interest of senators serving their own constituents and conflicting with other senators, many opportunities presented themselves for these legislators to work with each other or to exhibit a kind of reciprocity. This principle is nowhere better illustrated than the relationship between Republican Senator Orrin Hatch and the late Senator Edward Kennedy. Beholden to opposing political parties and ideologically opposed as well, these two powerful senators found ways to cooperate and compromise to mutual benefit. The Senate has developed an elaborate set of norms or folkways. Among the most important of these is the norm of reciprocity, a folkway which involves helping out a colleague and then getting repaid in kind. It includes vote trading, but extends to so many types of mutually rewarding behavior. Senator Hatch described the relationship this way. We did not agree on much, and more often than not, I was trying to derail whatever big government scheme he had just concocted. We did manage to forge partnerships on key legislation, such as the Ryan White AIDS Care Act, State Children's Health Insurance Program, and most recently, the Edward M. Kennedy Serve America Act. Ted was a lion among liberals, but he was also a constructive and shrewd lawmaker. He never lost sight of the big picture and was willing to compromise on certain provisions in order to move forward on issues he believed important. When our carefully balanced compromise legislation came to the Senate floor, Ted often had to lead the opposition to amendments offered by Democratic colleagues that he would rather have supported. But he took the integrity of our agreement seriously, and he protected the negotiated package. From no man's land in Belgium to the United States Senate, the decision to cooperate always involves some risk. What if the other side defects? Does the payoff justify the risk? This is a conundrum, and this conundrum of cooperation brings us to my own dilemma in lecturing on cooperation. When we talk about cooperation, we often default to talking about what game theorists called the prisoner's dilemma. Prisoner's dilemma was invented in 1950 by a pair of Rand Corporation researchers. We discussed in the last lecture how the prisoner's dilemma has been used to understand the nuclear arms race during the Cold War. But we didn't really discuss why. Now, mention of the prisoner's dilemma often elicits both groans of half familiarity and raised eyebrows of surprise. This is partly because many have heard of the game and partly because many have not. But for both groups, the same question often arises. Why do we talk so much, even referentially, about the prisoner's dilemma? What's so special about it? It's just this. This single model captures the dynamic in interactions of all kinds, even, for example, repeated interactions between foraging stickleback fish. Experiments show that these small fish, which get their name from the spines on their back, they achieve cooperation using a reciprocity strategy that resembles repeated rounds of the prisoner's dilemma game. This model isn't totally accurate. No model is. But it captures a fundamental dynamic inherent in many interactions. The tension between decisions for short-term self-interest or for long-term cooperative benefit. Like any good model, it is simple, and yet it explains much. in everything from evolutionary biology to networked computer systems. Robert Axelrod notes that the prisoner's dilemma model allows scholars from many different fields to talk to each other about strategy across the disciplines: political scientists, economists, sociologists, philosophers, mathematicians, computer scientists, evolutionary biologists. It also allows us to understand why it may be difficult to cooperate in our own interactions or begin to even trust someone else. As Axelrod notes, understanding the prisoner's dilemma can even aid in divorce negotiations. Let's do a quick review of prisoner's dilemma. There are two players. Each player has two choices: to cooperate or to defect. We call it prisoner's dilemma because its original form gave us two prisoners who faced the choice of informing on each other or of remaining silent. Each prisoner makes his choice without knowing what the other will do. Here's a typical payoff to illustrate the game. If both players defect, both players get $1. If both players cooperate, both players get $3. If one player defects while the other cooperates, the defector gets $5 and the cooperator gets $0. No matter what the other player does, defection yields a higher payoff than cooperation. If you think the other player will cooperate, you should defect. On the other hand, if you think the other player will defect, it still pays for you to defect. Therefore, the temptation for both is to defect, and this is what we call the dominant strategy. So it seems that cooperation is impossible. How do we escape this dilemma? We play the game more than once with the same opponent. If we play the game more than once, Robert Axelrod's pioneering work in the 1980s and 90s shows us that one very simple strategy works to get us out of the dilemma. And that strategy is called tit for tat. This is a strategy of simple reciprocity, which cooperates on the first move and then does whatever the other player did on the previous move. Axelrod determined this as the best strategy by means of a computer tournament in which he solicited the best minds of the country to submit computer programs to run iterations of the prisoner's dilemma. In the initial research, 2 rounds of a tournament were held, and the strategy of tit for tat won both of them. This strategy works best under these 5 conditions. First, we should avoid unnecessary conflict by cooperating as long as the other player does. Second, we respond quickly in the face of an uncalled for defection by the other. It's important to respond sooner rather than later. If you wait to respond to uncalled for defections, there's a risk of sending the wrong signal, one of weakness. Third, we show forgiveness after responding to a provocation, immediately return to a tit-for-tat reciprocity rather than start an escalation. Fourth, we show clarity of behavior so that the other player can recognize and adapt to our pattern of action. And finally, we have to have an expectation that we'll continue the interaction for a long and indefinite period of time. An indefinite number of these interactions is necessary for cooperation to emerge. For cooperation to prove stable, the future must have a sufficiently large shadow. In the lingo of cooperation theory, we must have a lengthy shadow of the future. Now, by pursuing these conditions, we can create an environment of accepted norms fertile for cooperations. Many institutions have developed stable patterns of cooperation based upon such similar norms. Diamond markets, for example. Their members exchange millions of dollars worth of goods with only a verbal pledge and a handshake. The key factor is that the participants know they will be dealing with each other again and again. Therefore, any attempt to exploit the situation simply does not pay. There's a lesson here. The strategy of reciprocity succeeds by eliciting cooperation from others, not by defeating them. In many situations, mutual cooperation can be better for both sides than mutual defection. Suppose you want to conduct business abroad in a country with little or no tradition of contract law. What do? Do you draw up detailed contracts listing specific penalties for non-performance of specific tasks? You can ask yourself what good such a detailed contract would be if broken. What would you gain if you tried to enforce it? I can speak from experience conducting business abroad in India and in Russia. I can conduct business on nothing more than a handshake and an email. I need not be friends with my international partner, nor need we trust each other. And I need not bother with detailed contracts, especially in countries with no tradition of contract law. And so I rely upon reciprocity. I look forward to a long future of cooperation. If the other side defects for a short-term gain, I respond quickly by signaling a clear defection of my own. If cooperation resumes, I ignore the previous defection. If defection persists, both sides forgo future benefits. In point of fact, I apply Robert Axelrod's theory to my own actions because, as he says, the shadow of the future provides the basis for cooperation, even among egoists. Armed with the cooperative dynamic in mind, where the horizon of the future stretches out, we can craft strategies apropos to the moment to maximize our long-term gains. In military affairs, we saw at the beginning of the lecture how the lowliest soldiers on opposing sides began to cooperate with each other to survive and to ease the daily hardships of life in the trenches. No one directed the cooperation. It emerged on its own in response to individual and mutual needs, and it arose between two sides facing each other for a long period of time, with a long shadow of the future. World War I had not ended quickly, and soldiers in Christmas 1914 had no idea how long it might last. But cooperation with enemies can also be orchestrated from the top of military hierarchies as well. When the dangers and costs of miscommunication become greater than any benefit derived from no cooperation, it lays the groundwork for mutually recognized and orchestrated cooperation. A familiar example is the hotline between Washington, D.C. and Moscow. The hotline is a direct, secure communication link between the U.S. and Russia that was established in 1963, and it directly resulted from the near-catastrophic Cuban Missile Crisis. In that crisis, miscommunication and delays took both countries to the brink of nuclear war, definitely a less than optimal result for both countries. Over subsequent years, the phone itself has been used a handful of times when elements in the national command structure deemed it necessary that direct superpower communication was indeed necessary. Apart from the hotline, military establishments are concerned with the problems of unintended escalation and nuclear missteps resulting from a miscommunication. During the latter stages of the Cold War, the U.S. and Soviet militaries found several ways to cooperate on some of the most dangerous issues threatening both nations. The U.S. and Russia were implacable enemies who fought each other politically around the world, and through their proxy countries they fought each other militarily. Yet, both saw the benefit of cooperation in carefully circumscribed areas. Neither side wanted the game they were playing to spiral out of control. They did not want it to leave the agreed-upon board of play, nor tempt the other side to violate the rules. The final cost, nuclear Armageddon, was one neither nation was willing to pay, and so they reached accommodations, particularly in the area of military exercises. Nation-states have always used their military forces to communicate to their potential adversaries, from military parades to military exercises to nuclear weapons testing. States try to communicate strength, resolve, commitment, readiness. The United States and the Soviet Union engaged in this brinksmanship for decades. India and Pakistan trade intimidating behavior. North and South Korea continually play dangerous war games. Now, the downside to all of this military signaling is that it can be misinterpreted as the real thing. It can have an entirely unanticipated result. What might appear to the signaling side as a clear message can be easily misinterpreted by the side receiving the message. This is particularly true of military exercises. Now, complicating the issue is that sometimes military exercises are used to mask an actual intent to invade. The Soviets did this very thing in August of 1968 when they crushed the liberal reforms of Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia with an invasion. Prior to the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, the Soviets hastily scheduled and held military exercises that served as cover for an actual invasion. Neman was a large Soviet mobilization exercise that it looked indistinguishable from an actual mobilization for war. Quite suddenly, invading forces from the Soviet Union, Poland, East Germany, Hungary, and Bulgaria quickly occupied Czechoslovakia. What might prevent the Soviets from another such deception against the West, masking an invasion of West Germany by exercises? For that reason, aggressive military exercises might reasonably be interpreted as the prelude to invasion, thus also sparking a preemptive strike by the threatened state. To forestall this possibility, the United States and the Soviets agreed to a regime of mutual inspections of military exercises called Confidence and Security Building Measures, or CSBMs. This was a form of cooperation between enemies that broke new ground. It incorporated military on-site inspections for the first time, and it was a trial run to test the feasibility of on-site inspections for nuclear weapons. I was a participant who received the Soviet inspectors for their very first inspection of American military exercises in 1987. It was a tense affair. Reciprocity was only just being established, but it laid the groundwork for numerous inspections to come and the development of a regime of military cooperation that lasted throughout the 1990s. Another extreme example of cooperation between enemies is the designated truce zone on the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. This is a strip of land over 150 miles long and only 2.5 miles wide, and it's the most fortified border on Earth, with more than 1 million soldiers facing each other in a technical state of war that has existed since a ceasefire was agreed to in 1953. A ceasefire, not a peace treaty, is in force. Cooperation under these conditions is extremely difficult, especially given that more than 50 Americans and 1,000 South Koreans have died in hostilities along this border, just policing it. And yet, even under these conditions of mutual deadly hostility, both sides found it useful to cooperate with each other in accepted and routinized ways. The combatants established a joint security area in the village of Panmunjom on the DMZ. It's a place we've discussed before. Discussions between North and South are held in blue buildings that straddle the military demarcation line. This joint security area is a circular area roughly a half-mile in diameter. It serves as a neutral area where free movement of both sides anywhere within the JSCA boundaries. There are several powder blue one-story buildings where officials from the two sides meet when necessary. The conference table covered with green velvet sits directly over the border line, and a microphone cable runs down the middle of the table and is recognized as the international border. Cooperation can emerge elsewhere as well, in less contentious surroundings. 19th century science reminds us not to count too much on the durability of the systems we create. The second law of thermodynamics explains how systems of order will tend toward disorder and chaos in a process of entropy. But clearly, this is not always the case. Another theory describes a different outcome. In fact, the theory of spontaneous order suggests the exact opposite, that out of chaos, social order can emerge spontaneously. This is at the heart of a theoretical notion that regimes of cooperation are possible if we pursue them. Theory. When I talk about theory to my students, I sometimes see the eyes begin to glaze over. But a good theory should not just explain, it should predict. It should be useful. It should always link to the real world. The idea of spontaneous order is one such theory. The theory of spontaneous order describes the emergence of social order from combinations of self-interested individuals who are not intentionally trying to create a system. People even build structures when they're not consciously trying to do so. It suggests that even structures can emerge spontaneously through the independent actions of individuals acting in their own self-interest. A simple example of this is the dirt path across a meadow. It's likely that no one person chooses to build a path across the meadow. In this particular place and direction, hundreds, perhaps thousands of people chose to walk that route for their own purposes. As a result, the path, a structure, was constructed through this principle of spontaneous order. The self-regulating market economy is another example of spontaneous order. The market economy is a system animated by people pursuing their economic self-interest, creating value, conducting commerce. The father of modern economics, Adam Smith, called this process the invisible hand in his famous work on economics, The Wealth of Nations. In the pursuit of individual self-interest, thousands of individuals create a system of economic exchange. It regulates itself through prices. Prices inform us of the relative supply and demand of thousands of goods and services. This, of course, stands in contradistinction to Thomas Hobbes' prediction that a world without planned structure would be a war of all against all, where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Surely Hobbes' world would be the result in a world without a planned economic allocation method. Surely, given that resources are scarce and humanity's seeming proclivity toward violence would all but guarantee that conflict and bloodshed would occur. But often as not, peaceful means of exchange are routinized over time as participants recognize the rational self-interest of pursuing cooperative strategies. In business, competing firms sometimes find it necessary to cooperate rather than to compete. In fact, cartels and price fixing would be far more common were they not illegal in many wealthy countries. But even without explicit collusion, firms often refrain from unilateral action in order to avoid unpleasant responses from competitors. Price wars are an example of what can happen when tacit cooperation breaks down. Price wars benefit consumers, of course, and from that point of view, we all enjoy the benefits of competition. But for the firms involved, shrinking profit margins can also make the difference between survival and collapse. One instance in which businesses cooperate is the strategic alliance. And this is a form of cooperation in which two or more firms align and harmonize their strategic actions. They do this because the benefits of cooperation are greater than that achieved by unfettered competition. In such an arrangement, companies seek synergy, where the whole result becomes greater than the sum of its parts. At times, a strategic cooperation makes sense because other avenues to synergy are closed. For instance, in 2011, the communications giant AT&T ran afoul of the U.S. Justice Department and the Federal Communications Commission when it sought to acquire cellular carrier T-Mobile. The Justice Department thwarted the deal. They cited concerns about the effect such a merger might have on consumers. After retreating, AT&T and T-Mobile pursued instead a cooperative arrangement. AT&T sought access to T-Mobile's cellular airwaves to relieve its own congested network. And for its part, T-Mobile, with its small share of the market, sought survival in an industry where scale offers important advantages. The companies agreed to a 7-year roaming agreement to expand T-Mobile's national coverage. This isn't the optimum solution that the competing companies sought, but it still serves the purpose of a strategic alliance to obtain synergies unavailable to either company in isolation. One final surprising example of cooperation in the midst of conflict, even when the conflict is institutionalized in a rigid system. I met and interviewed Alexei Kondyurov in 2005 while working on a project in Moscow, and I find him to be not only an interesting man, but a living example of cooperation theory in action. Until the early 2000s, Alexei worked for Yukos Oil Company as head analyst, after which he became a member of the Duma, the Russian Congress. But Alexei is famous or infamous for another former occupation earlier in his career. Alexei Kondyurov served as a KGB general. In fact, Alexei was the general who headed the infamous 5th Directorate of the KGB, which was responsible for dissident control. It was created in 1967 by KGB head Yuri Andropov. Alexei held the position under Gorbachev until the KGB was restructured and became the FSB. Alexei's job was to crack down on dissidents, to disrupt their protests, to sometimes arrest and detain them. But Alexei was respected by the dissident community, for Alexei is a pragmatic man. He had a job to do, and he recognized that dissidents have a job to do as well, to dissent. Alexei served during the era of glasnost and perestroika and he did not want to brutalize demonstrators nor crack down on them as had been done by his predecessors. They achieved a shaky accommodation. There was an understood line that, if crossed, would provoke a police response. Now, that line varied from protest to protest, but was understood, and it was observed for the most part during the last several Gorbachev years. In essence, this was a mutual survival game, a live and let live rapprochement, a strange and surprising example of cooperation. Yet this is typical of the kind of game we play when we're faced with repeated interactions with an opponent over time, especially when our own personal interests may conflict with the larger interests of an organization we may serve. The problem of cooperation presents us with conundrums that, at first pass, may seem unresolvable, but cooperation theory shows us, and economics confirms, that where people of goodwill wish to better their lives, they always find a way to trade, to exchange, to exist to each other's mutual benefit. They find ways to cooperate in strategies that maximize everybody's welfare.